Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you something that is related to combining and separating mesh, and also when you select the faces of a mesh and duplicate or separate them, there's some stuff happening that I want to show you how to manage them. Okay, so let's start. Let's say you have created a cylinder, and let's say you wanted it, you have placed it somewhere in the space, in the 3D space of Maya. Also you created a cube and they're put on top of each other and you have combined them. Okay, something that it's better not to do, we know that, right? We don't combine meshes that we just placed next to each other, because that's you asking for trouble, asking Maya to crash whenever it wants, right? And we don't want to do that. So let's say I combine these two meshes. For combine, I can select both these meshes and do okay, I should be in the modeling menu, and then I go to mesh and say combine, right? And now they're both combined. Okay, and later you realize, okay, I shouldn't be combining these meshes, right? So I want to separate them. So the key, the tool to separate the meshes that you combined is right underneath the combine tool, right? If you go to mesh, right underneath combine, it's separate. Okay, so look at my screen when I hit separate. Okay, as soon as I do separate, you can see that the pivot point for both these objects, they change to be at the center of the grid, right? And also you can notice that although they're not at the position of 0, 0 at the center of the grid, their translation and rotation and scale is set to their default setting. Like it shows as 0, right? For rotation and translation, and scale 1. That's why, because this is the default setting for any object that gets created in Maya, as soon as you do separate, every history on the object gets deleted. Well, maybe not the history, but what Maya does is that it freezes the transformation. This is called freeze transformation, okay? And you can use that later with your 3D models, and we get to that when you put your objects where they're supposed to be, and you want to preserve that place, so you freeze your transformation so everything is set to 0, and then you're going to know whenever you put 0 for translation and rotation, your object is going to be in the place where it is supposed to be. Okay, but in this case this is not desirable for us, right? We don't want the pivot point to be at the center of the grid while our objects are floating over here, and we also don't want the translation to be 0, right? So and this is something that might happen some other ways, like if you separate the faces or duplicate them, this happens too. So let's figure out how to go around these two things that are happening. The first thing, the pivot point that jumps to center. And the second thing would be how to set the translation to the actual number that they're supposed to be, right? We want them to be 0 at this stage of 3D modeling, okay? We want them to be at 0 when they're at the center of the grid, not when they're up there, right? Okay, so let's do that. So the first thing is easy, okay? So you can see that both of their pivot point is in the center of the grid, and I want the pivot point. For example, the default setting for the pivot point when you create objects, it's at the center of the object, okay? So what I need to do is that to tell Maya, center the pivot for each of these objects, right? So I'm just gonna click both of them. I think it works with both. And while I'm in the modeling menu set, I go to modify, and then do under pivot, it says center pivot. Okay, so I'm just going to click on it, and you can see that this pivot for these two objects, they're all set at their center, right? That's exactly what I want for these two objects, okay? So the only thing that is left is that I need to set this transformation to be 0, not here, but when they're at the center of the grid. So let's do that. So there are multiple ways to do this. What I'm going to show you here is through creating a locator. Okay. First, let's delete history on these two objects. I can see that I have these empty groups and this build-up history. I want to get rid of that because I don't want Maya to crash. So I just go in the polymodeling shelf and click delete history. Okay, so, and something that I should have mentioned when I talked about grouping is that if you want to ungroup, like if you have grouped these two objects, you haven't grouped them here. Maya does that when you combine and then separate objects, it just puts them in one group. So to ungroup them, one thing you can do is middle click, drag out, or you can also click on any object that you want to be ungrouped and hit Shift P on your keyboard, and then it's going to be grouped under the word and not under the group, and this group is now empty. Okay. So before you delete the groups that are empty, make sure you delete history on the objects, because sometimes when you delete the group without deleting history on objects, it can delete materials with it. So yeah, just to make sure that nothing gets ruined here, select the objects, do delete history, and then you can go in and delete the empty group. Okay, so that's that part about ungrouping in the outliner. So let's get to our main task for this tutorial, the first one. We took care of that by centering the pivot for each object. Now we want to put them back in the center and then set the translation to be 0. Okay, so to do that, what I'm going to do is that I want to create something at the center so that they have something to tell them to, okay, come here and snap to this. Okay, you can do it multiple ways. I'm just going to use a locator to do that. So I'm going to go to create. And if I look here, you can see there's a locator. And this is just, it doesn't have any geometry. It's not an object. It's just, as the name implies, it's a locator. Okay. So I'm just going to click on locator. Like any other object, it's going to be created at the center and the translation is set to 0. And it's a perfect thing to be matching objects to because it doesn't have any geometry. And the point that it has is exactly at the center, right? Like, that's going to be easy for me to match them to. So we have something in the center of the project. Now, all you need to do to get them to exactly at center is that you need to snap them to center. Okay, we used the snapping before. You can use these icons that are showing here, the one that says snap to point probably, or snap to grid. I'm just going to hold down V, and that's going to be this shortcut to this, which says snap to points. Okay, so I'm going to click on my object, holding down V. I want to snap it to the center of the grid, so I'm just going to do come here, come here. Now it is a snap to the center of the grid to the point, right? Okay, so that's that. So now that the object is at the center of the grid, I can see that it shows translation where because it is considering this place like in relation to the previous place that it was, right? But we want to this translation to be set to 0. So what we can do here is that we can go and freeze transformation. And what it does is that it sets all the transformation to their default value. Like it's going to set translate to 0 and all rotation to 0 and scale to 1. And that's exactly what I want. So while I have my object selected, again, I'm going to go to modify, and this time I'm going to do freeze transformation, right? And I want everything to be freeze, so I'm not going to go to the option here. Because the default is like it's gonna set everything to the default. If you want to check that, you can click on this square here and make sure all these 3 are checked, right? Or you can just do edit, reset setting, and the default setting is like this. So I'm just gonna hit freeze transformation, and now you can see that this object, the transformation is set to the default. Right? And now if you want to like extrude and do stuff like that and then move it back to the place, it's going to be like as if you just created this object, right? So I'm going to do the same for the cube. And so now that I know this is at the center, I can just push it away. No big deal, because I know if I set this translation to 0, it's going to be jumped back to the center, right? So I can just move it away. Now it's the cube's turn. So I'm just going to click on the cube, hold down V for snap, and I'm going to snap it to the center of the grid, right? I'm going to release V, and now it's time to freeze transformation. So I'm just going to do that. I'm going to go to modify and do freeze transformation, and that's that, right? I can put this to 0 to get it back to center, and now I have these objects here, right? And I can set you know, put them in display layers if I want to work on multiple objects at a time, right? So okay, I think that's that for this. Thanks for watching.